the sector manager for construction with Zero Waste Scotland, and we specifically in the construction team are looking at how we can integrate circular economy into construction, and primarily sort of embedding a number of key principles into the design and procurement phases, and work with clients to do this. So there's a bit of a rundown of the content. I've done this slideshow before in its various sort of incarnations in 15 minutes. I've also done it in an hour, so I'll keep an eye on the time and try not to ramble too much, but there's probably some stuff in here which actually I don't need to go over, given it's sort of given the people who are in on this. So I guess what we normally start out with is a bit of context setting, so understanding that the current way the economy operates is linear. We don't refer to it as linear economy, it's just the economy to us. And it has worked fine for the past however many years, hundreds or thousands of years. We take things out of the ground, we make stuff with them, and then we landfill them. And that's been okay because a lot of the materials we've used have been relatively sort of harmless, and they've been organic in nature, and they've either broken down in the ground and returned to sort of where they came from, or they have just stayed as is and not interacted much with the environment. But now we're starting to produce things that are very complex, they're synthetic, they have all sorts of chemicals in them, and they're finding their way from landfill into our environment, into the marine environment, and into the terrestrial environment, and into ecosystems, and all sorts of nasty things are happening. Coupled with that is that a lot of the resources we use are finite, and we're using them at a rate that is completely unsustainable, and the way that we're using them is producing pollution and changing the environment. So there's a number of the risks outlined there. This is just an interesting little graph that shows we are having an impact on the CO2 levels in our atmosphere more than we have. This goes back 400,000 years, but actually there's I think data goes back to around 800,000, and then after that it's a little bit less reliable. But what you can see is that since the Industrial Revolution, we've had a big impact, and that's of course impacted our environment. And the 5 warmest years have happened in the past 20, and that trend is likely to continue. So we need to understand how that's going to impact not only the environment, but the requirements of the built environment that we create. And also, of course, the population of the Earth is growing, and it's looking like it's going to continue to do so into the 22nd century. The emerging middle classes, I think, or the emerging economies like Mexico, Brazil, and India, there's huge promise there, but there's also a sort of a materials revolution going on, and there is people want to have access to mobile phones and all sorts of stuff that we've had access to, and live a life like ours, but that places pressures on the environment. And here you can see this sort of relates more to digital components, but this is high risk resources that are required for the operation of a lot of our digital devices, and also things like natural rubber, cobalt, and these sorts of things. They're often in areas of political instability. But what risk really means is price volatility. That really translates to price volatility. And when the price of things is volatile, it means that we can't really predict it. And for construction, an industry that consumes around half the resources of Scotland, this is really impactful because it has repercussions throughout the supply chain. And any services or materials that are being bought this will impact. And if material costs and service costs are staying static, then somebody is taking the hit along the way, and that can't continue to happen. So here's a few high-level stats for the construction sector in Scotland. 50% of the UK's resource consumption, 50% of the waste. On the UK level, it's 40% of the country's emissions. 1 in 10 people work in the construction industry, and around 10% GVA and GDP is derived from construction. So you can see we're kind of hitting all the key areas there. There's an environmental imperative, there's a social imperative, and there is an economic imperative for us to act on this and us to begin to look at how we've previously been delivering the built environment as not really working, and these are symptoms of that. Also, this is from Digitization Index from McKinsey, and I think actually this was a slide that I saw ages ago at a presentation at the Construction Scotland Innovation Centre, so I hope it wasn't in your presentation, Lucy, but I have pinched this. And what it basically says, if you look at the bottom, that construction is the least sort of digitally literate sector. And actually they've taken it out, but there used to be one sector below that, which was hunting and fishing, and they've taken that out, so construction comes dead last.
I know, I've just switched off mute because I use that slide a lot, but agriculture and fishing still sit beneath it from the version we have, so it's interesting to see it's now at the bottom, construction. So although it's still the same year, I noticed 2015. So
well, maybe I have to check our references so that I'm not using but I guess the message is
clear.
The opportunity for construction to integrate digital technology is huge, and we're seeing it happen all around. But I think in the actual build process, there's very little. Sometimes we see for high-profile projects, they sort of have virtual reality maps that the clients can walk around and look at their projects, but by and large, that doesn't really happen. So there's a number of key policy drivers here, but actually I was talking to my colleague Clive Bowman yesterday, and actually there are no key policy drivers that refer to circular economy. The Climate Change Act has, Scotland's just issued a response to the climate emergency, which says we're going to produce net zero carbon by 2045. So that means that it's not just scope 1 emissions, so from the gas boilers in our houses, and scope 2 would be the likes of electricity, the things we use where the carbon is burned elsewhere, but actually scope 3, so the likes of the emissions that arise from the manufacturing of the laptops that we use or the washing machines that we use that were made in China, but we are still accountable for those emissions. And that's going to be a real challenge for construction because a lot of what is currently being delivered by way of built assets will still be around in 25 years. And so they will need to be retrofitted or changed in some way so that they can meet that net zero carbon target. And actually, when we look at our Scotland's footprint, our carbon footprint, actually 80% of the emissions are from those scope 3 emissions. So this is a big problem that is looming, and it's a bit of a cost bubble which is going to burst if we don't act on this. And then extended producer responsibility, which previously looked at packaging materials. Well, now they're looking to extend that to actually not just packaging materials, but construction materials. And they're zeroing in on construction as a key sector there, understanding that it's a big consumer of packaging. And there are a number of problem materials such as plasterboard that come out of that. Also, the building regulations, I guess these were key policy drivers. There is something there is a labeling process you can go through, and in order to achieve gold standard, there's a number of requirements, design requirements you must meet, which are set out in Zero Waste Scotland's Designing Out Waste document. And I think that is a bit more of a driver as we see things like passive house standards get adopted by local authorities, or the Glasgow standard, and I think Edinburgh is doing something similar. And then the rest of these you can maybe go back and look at. I'm not going to touch on them all. This is just an example of how variable materials can be in their cost at end of life. Mixed low-grade dirty plastic, you'll pay someone about £100 per tonne to take away. But if you were going through enough of this stuff and you could collect it and group it all into, say, polypropylene, then you could grade that, wash it, and there's a global shortage of PP, and sell that for up to £500 a tonne. So there's this idea of materials having value. I guess people maybe don't tune into that enough. And of course, in construction, we use a lot of steel and metal, and that's high value, and I think that's always been acknowledged. But even recycling this represents a big value loss. Whereas if we were to design things in such a way as we could reuse the steel at the end of the building's life, there would be a huge value retention in that. And glass is much and such the same. Glass is probably one of the least recycled materials in construction. It's generally downcycled into aggregates or road paints or glass wool for insulation. But that, again, for a component which is so carbon intensive, that's quite represents quite a value loss. So we don't even like to see that. And this is what we're talking about, that the highest value and best use is really at the top of the waste hierarchy, where we either don't use something at all, or we use it in such a way that it can be reused, or we in turn we reuse something. And then obviously right down at the bottom is disposal. I'd like to try and think that we should change our mindset so that recycling is actually looked at the least best option, and landfill and disposal isn't even on the table. We shouldn't really think of that. Recycling is great, and it's a part of the solution, but there are so many other things we could do before that. And again, it goes back to how we procure and how we design things. And that's the waste hierarchy from the European Waste Framework Directive. And so this is what the proposed solution. More and more people are beginning to understand this, and it's actually parts of the circular economy have been in action for a number of years. This repair, reuse, refurbish, recycle. It's not just because we need to conserve resources and we need to reduce carbon. It makes sense because it makes good business sense, really. There are companies like SPX or Clyde Pumps that specialise in sort of repair, reuse, refurbishment of industrial pumps. And the aftercare is a huge selling point for them, for their service. And they will even repair sort of legacy pumps, things that work well and perhaps are the only ones of their kind, but no one else will touch. And I guess other companies would walk in and propose that you have to buy new kit, and this is sometimes not the best way forward. So these concentric rings, as you head outwards, they indicate sort of a little bit more loss of value. So we want to keep things, materials in as high circulation, as high value state as possible for as long as possible. And these are a number of the benefits that go with it. So when we talk about...
An alarm has just gone off in my house, so I'm just going to explore, okay? Sorry.
Okay, no worries. That's the first excuse. That's the first time I've heard that excuse. But where were we? Yeah. So looking at the basic principles of um, circular economy in construction, and how do we integrate that? And actually, what you begin to see when you peek beyond the term circular economy is that actually these are by and large common sense, and they don't require any great degree of technical expertise to implement. It's about asking for these sorts of services and being educated as clients and as delivery agents of the built environment. So material selection, understanding that things that are bonded together with glues and sort of wet sealants, often this renders them unrecyclable, or it makes the sort of economic incentive to recycle them much less than if they were easy to separate and segregate. A good example of this is SIPS panels. When SIPS panels sort of came into onto the scene, they were hailed as a brilliant solution, part of the off-site construction. But actually, two bits of wood that are glued to some high-density insulation in the middle, they are very, very difficult to recycle, and then many times at the end of the building's life, they'll probably find their way into landfill. So we want to just begin to be more considerate about the materials that we choose and ensure that we understand their lifespans, we understand that what they can go on to be in terms of reuse or recycled, or do they even contain recycled content. We also want buildings to be built for accessibility. So that's not in terms of motability, of course that's a requirement, but in terms of being able to maintain and repair those buildings and refurbish them. Quite often buildings are built, and this is not in mind, so to access services and to access utilities, you need to cause some damage to the building, or you need to do something invasive, and it's disruptive to the building, it's disruptive to the building fabric, the occupants, and it creates waste, and it costs money. And there are ways of doing this that's not necessary. Also, designing for longevity, flexibility, adaptability. These are all things that are a sort of continuation of that, so that we are building in ways that we appreciate the building life is not, or the building use will change over time, and it's trying to anticipate that the building will change in its use, and how do we do that, whether it's by making an office open plan and having movable partitions or otherwise. And designing for ease of assembly, so that might include off-site construction and ensuring that we can, at the end of the building's life, we can recover the materials. And designing out waste, as I said, we have a guide on that there. So this is some examples of just whatever very, very straightforward things. Running the utilities through the skirting board, so that if there's any repair or maintenance needing to happen, it can just be unscrewed and it can be accessed. Floorboards held in place by screwed tips. So you just unscrew these slots and the floorboards come up, they're not glued down with anything. All that takes is some good fitting. And installing windows. Windows are often need to be replaced when the seal breaks. So allowing a little bit of room there allows much easier replacement. So we're also on the agenda, and I'll just spend a minute or two on this. I note that I'm almost out of time. We have a number of resources at Zero Waste Scotland that we've developed over the years, and one of them is this Construction Materials Exchange. It is basically a platform to allow to facilitate the exchange of materials from a construction project to small, medium-sized enterprises or another project. And it works by you register, you take a photo of your materials, and then you can list them in here. And they're basically a number of, and CPAR are supportive of this. We just have to ensure that, you know, there's certainty of use, and you can list it under a number of these categories. And this isn't a sort of exhaustive list. You can create more if you need to. So this is something that we're going to be promoting a lot more, and trying to find opportunities for its use. I think it's a really, really good resource, and we're beginning to see other things like this appear on the market. We know this works. The Industrial Symbiosis program previously worked, and there are a number of ones going on around the world. So we'd like to sort of promote that and have it used as much as possible. We also have this guide for maximising the reuse of on-site materials, and it really talks through who you might be, whether you're a client, design team, contractor, subcontractor, understanding what sorts of materials arise on site and how these can be reused. Finally, I don't know how relevant this is, but we are sponsoring a RIAS award, and there are a number of criteria which are relevant to that, and you will need to meet. So what I'll do is I'll circulate this, and this is really for any sort of estates teams that would like to have a go. And finally, this is the Designing Out Waste guide that I mentioned earlier. What I'll do is, Jill, maybe if you could send round a few links to these, and maybe if people have questions, they can sort of get in touch with me directly.
Yes, of course. I can send links to this with the minutes and the resources. Great.
Okay. Well, there we go. There and there. I think that's the last slide there, which is just some of the key resources, free resources from Zero Waste Scotland, and yes, hopefully they're useful.